Mark Cerny kicked off the presentation with The Last of Us Part 2, which was a bit of a contentious choice because ultimately it started out live on PlayStation 4, right? But PlayStation 5 version has much to praise, and now we've got a PS5 Pro version. Who took a look at this? Oliver, do you want to take point on this one?
Yes, I love T-Lu and T-Loop Part 2. And I think this is a very interesting first showing because it is a very effective PSSR upgrade. Like, subjectively speaking, both sides of the image, which are the PS5 Fidelity mode, which is at native 4K, and the PS5 Pro version with no particular mode specified, they look very similar. Now, there are some differences. To me, the most significant difference is that the grass in the PS5 PSSR view tends to ghost a bit, to basically blend together a little bit in motion, whereas the native 4K view on PS5 presents clean, sharp grass in every frame, which is like a typical trouble area for reconstruction solutions, often a sore spot for FSR2, which has a particularly nasty resolve on those elements. But here it's not so bad. I think it might be a common feature of PSSR based on some other games. But yeah, and there's some other minor problems, like the roots above Elia in the scene do shimmer just a tiny bit as the player moves forward. There might be a little bit of subpixel issues there. But T-Lu Part 2 doesn't have the best TAA either, so when you compare it to T-Lu Part 2, it actually doesn't come across too bad. It actually looks pretty good. And of course, these are all just like super nitpicky critiques. If you're actually playing the game, especially with motion blur, you know, you're not going to notice these problems probably in all likelihood when actually playing the game in most situations, I would suspect. But I think the interesting thing for me here, and potentially the part that's going to be a little bit controversial, but I think is totally explainable and totally fine, is that in terms of raw numbers, we're looking at 1440p here at 60 FPS. I counted 4 or 5 frames. They all counted it at 1440p, which is actually the same resolution as the PS5 in its performance mode. And the nice thing here is that PSSR is pretty easy for us to pixel count at the moment, so it's actually not too hard to find those numbers. But critically, because the PS5 in its performance mode is using a bilinear or maybe bicubic upscale from 1440p to 4K, it's not giving you any extra detail, whereas the PS5 Pro is upsampling that 1440p to 4K, kind of like DLSS's quality mode. It's doing a very good job of that. It looks very similar to a native 4K render, like you can see in the side-by-sides here. So I think it's a very effective and probably fairly typical kind of upgrade that I think we will see a fair bit of on PS5 Pro, and it is a very good upgrade for sure.
Interesting. So, Alex, let's have some conjecture here. The same resolution, but it's not really, because that's not really the way reconstruction techniques work, right? You're not dealing with a singular base resolution. There's a lot more to it, right?
Yeah, well, so there's the things you have to consider here too. PSSR is going to have its own cost in frame time to essentially get the image up to 4K. And usually that cost is just a function of the output resolution. For DLSS, for example, it's just the matter of, even if it's 1080p or 720p internal, the cost of upscaling to 4K, the upscaling time will be the same. And I think we read from internal documentation that'll be around 2 milliseconds or so, at least for the initial release of PSSR, which is, that's a sizable amount of a 16.6 millisecond frame time budget for a game targeting 60 FPS. So you've got that takes up its own amount of time to get up there. So if you're paying attention and want to get 60 FPS, you have to budget still. And another budgeting aspect about post-process upscaling via image reconstruction is that it's technically, at least as the way DLSS is supposed to be done, the post-processing effects such as motion blur, potentially bloom, potentially depth of field, a lot of them should technically be run after DLSS at the native output resolution at that point. So you would have things like depth of field running at 4K. And as we know, depth of field, like when you get right close to a character and it blooms out and you get those really big bokeh shapes, that's when it gets really, really expensive usually. So if they have to contend with the cost potentially of 4K post-processing, on top of the fact that it costs 2 milliseconds already, and the fact that the GPU is only 45% better, according to Mark Cerny saying it in a video, for things that are like typical rasterization, well, then it makes sense, actually, I think, if they want to keep a consistent 60 FPS, to keep the internal resolution very similar, if not just maybe a tiny bit higher, and then just let PSSR make the quality much higher. And I think that's the way I would also do it on PC, too. If I were a PC player, I wouldn't necessarily just run everything at flat 4K just because I can. So there's that. There's also the fact that we're dealing with a power-constrained console. We haven't had too much evidence of it yet, but technically there is a balance there between overloading the GPU and the CPU on the PS5 that the Xbox Series X doesn't have, for example. And if they want to keep the frame rate high at 60 at all times, it makes sense to not just run everything flat out. They want to, I would say, reserve power for the parts when they might need them at different points in the storyline. So I feel like there's a couple of conjecture reasons here we can throw out as to why it's still 1440p internally. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is the image quality. And generally, it's close enough and better in some aspects to the native 4K presentation from Fidelity Mode, which is kind of why machine learning based reconstruction is great, right? So
yeah, it's kind of like the whole point of the exercise really is that, the emergence of DLSS on PC has basically meant the concept of what your base internal resolution is versus what actually hits your eyeballs is quite different at this point. And this is the first proper console implementation of a machine learning based reconstruction formula. And as first impressions go, I think it looks pretty good here. But it also highlights the fact that going forward, console designs aren't just going to be throwing a huge amount of extra transistors at the size of the GPU because they just can't do that. The economics don't work. And, we're already seeing the economics pushed to the limits with PlayStation 5 Pro. If you can imagine how much this system would have cost if they didn't have PSSR and instead they were going for 96 compute units or whatever's required to actually, double and then some the performance of a base PlayStation 5. It's a fool's errand. So, it's all about basically producing an efficient design. And we're going to be critiquing PSSR compared to DLSS and other upscaling solutions. But ultimately, I think the other thing to bear in mind is that as of yet, very few people are actually connecting their PCs to living room displays. It's typically displays that are right in front of you. So, the actual effect of the presentation at range is also going to be quite different. But this is an interesting thing. And it's an interesting example of basically like for like native versus reconstructed. And it's not bad. I think it's pretty good. Do we have anything more to say about The Last of Us Part 2? It's I don't know. If you think about prior Naughty Dog patches, I mean, I don't think this has been like a core focus of development for them. It's obviously a bolt-on extra. So when we actually come to proper first-party titles that are developed with both SKUs in mind, then we'll probably see something quite different. But this is certainly just an interesting, what did you call it, Oliver? Prototypical.
I think it is prototypical.
Prototypical use of PSSR.
I'd also say that it also is the case this game is likely not using dynamic resolution based on the fact that no Naughty Dog titles have used dynamic resolution. So maybe there is a little bit more juice left to squeeze, and we're just not seeing it quite here.